Funciona, probando. ¿Lo tenéis? ¿Sí? Bueno, bienvenidos y bienvenidas. Disculpad por el retraso. Hemos tenido un pequeño retraso de producción. Yo soy Eduardo Castillo, soy responsable comisarial de Medialab aquí en Matadero y la verdad es que es un gusto teneros aquí con nosotros en esta sesión que hacemos con 3 colectivos muy especiales con los que estamos trabajando justamente durante esta semana en el contexto de un taller que estamos desarrollando en Medialab que se llama Cooking Earth, que es parte de una de nuestras líneas de investigación dentro del marco de nuestro segundo laboratorio, llamado el Sublime Metabólico, donde exploramos o nos preguntamos por otros metabolismos energéticos y materiales a escala planetaria desde un replanteamiento muy amplio de lo que tenemos por energía. Dentro de ese contexto, uno de los metabolismos energéticos que pensamos que son trascendentales a la hora de plantear otros regímenes energéticos a escala planetaria es el de la comida, ¿no? Y por eso estamos haciendo este taller aquí. Pensamos que las implicaciones sistémicas que tiene el cómo producimos, el cómo distribuimos y el cómo consumimos la comida, ¿no?, es muy relevante y cómo eso además se aproxima a cuestiones que tienen una gran implicación cultural. Es decir, y es una de las cosas que yo creo que se van a tratar en esta sesión de aquí con los participantes, que ahora los presento brevemente, que es el impacto que tiene la cultura o el cómo percibimos la comida o el cómo entendemos la comida a nivel sistémico. Para eso, lo primero, bueno, daros las gracias a los invitados. Tenemos por un lado a Remo Gysi y tenemos a Susan Tobler, que vienen del colectivo Taste Lab de Zurich, ¿vale? Tenemos también a nuestros 2 comisarios del taller de Cooking Earth, que son Philip Maugan y Andrea Provenzano, que no solamente estarán moderando la sesión de hoy, sino que ellos han sido los encargados de llevar a cabo todo el taller que empezamos el lunes y que cerrará mañana. Y tenemos a Nora Silva, que viene por parte del colectivo The Grammons, pero también es miembro del colectivo Fondo, que también está haciendo una actividad con nosotros un poquito más tarde aquí en Medialab. Daros las gracias por asistir, por estar con nosotros hoy aquí y le paso la palabra a Philip y Andrea para que nos cuenten de qué vamos a hablar hoy.
Gracias, Eduardo. Hi, everybody. My name is Philip. I'm a writer and researcher from the UK, and this is my colleague, Andrea. We are together the research platform Black Almanac, or at least we're 2 members of it. It's getting bigger every day. So the title of this evening's conversation is Cooking with Information, Science, Art, and the Transformation of the Food System. And I'm going to begin by basically explaining what I think that means. So about 2 years ago, our project, Black Almanac, began as a kind of exercise in speculative design, where we tried to answer essentially a very simple question. What will the food that we eat in the year 2050 look like? It seems simple enough on first glance, but given the ways that food production today is responsible for about 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, 1.3 billion tons of waste every year, and the degradation of half the Earth's soil, it becomes a little bit more difficult to imagine business as usual. By 2050, the number of humans on Earth is expected to approach around 10 billion. If we are to abolish hunger and feed everyone fairly, we're going to need to produce roughly 70% more food than we do at the moment. And we got to do that in ways that are sustainable, nutritious, ecologically sound, but also crucially delicious. At this point, the task seems more or less impossible. And it's only going to continue seeming impossible so long as we remain fixated on the past. If we take a step back for a moment, we can see that our relationship to food is held in place not only by the staggering farming subsidies that governments pay to farmers every year, but also by aggressive corporate marketing, restrictive industry financing, and to suffocating intellectual property laws. There are all these material and economic forces keeping things in place, but also there is a regressive cultural obsession with nostalgic pastoralism and agrarian simplicity that dates back at least to the Roman poet Virgil, but can also be felt today in everything from product packaging to video games. Yet agriculture itself is a collaborative technology that emerged in various places at different times across the planet, an engine for civilization building that has always been risky, always been strange, and always been difficult, and has required us to embrace the new in response to a changing environment and a changing world. So one thing I'm not too worried about is culinary innovation, that valuable practice known as cooking, a behavior that is unique to humans and may in fact be the most human thing about us. The sourcing and mixing of ingredients, techniques, and expertise emerged from the transformation of raw into cooked, a process of deconstruction and regeneration that can be applied equally to science, to art, to programming, to urbanism and politics just as easily as it can be applied to food. So tonight's discussion is titled Cooking with Information, and together we're going to unpack the interplay between food, science, and creativity, a process that has always relied on transmitting knowledge and structuring relationships around a common goal. Some of the oldest texts we have are farmers' almanacs, databases of instructions and climate modeling that were carried around first on stone tablets, later as printed books, and today on entirely new kinds of tablets that we carry around in our pockets. Our hope for Black Almanac is to create a resource and point of connection for people interested in new ways of thinking about the food system, regardless of whether their role within it is as a producer, a chef, a technologist, or simply as an eater. In order to transform the food system, we're going to need cooks of every kind and every age, as our little intern is here to attest. Which is precisely why our workshop Cooking Earth this week at Medialab-Matadero has brought together guests from fields like design, the humanities, engineering, philosophy, art and science. The history of agriculture is symbolically associated with the dark alluvial plains of the Nile River Delta, a productive zone and experimental laboratory that provided the conditions for testing new growing techniques. It was the ancient Greek historian Herodotus who famously noticed the triangular shape at the mouth of the Nile, comparing it to the Greek letter delta, which of course in mathematics means change. Both art and science are powerful avenues for transformation and will be vital tools in the task of feeding humans without destroying the planet. Today, we're going to explore what role they play in an age of networks, satellites, databases, and platforms to ask what the food system may look like in 2050 and for many centuries after that. So I'm going to now invite Remo and Sue to tell us about the work that Taste Lab have been up to, their own background, and where they think we might be heading. Do you want to sit here? And no.
Hello everyone, we're very happy to be here. We're Remo and Sue from Taste Lab. The Taste Lab is all about the future of food, which for us is the combination between food science and sustainability. Since our founding in 2016, our work has taken various shapes. We've done caterings, pop-ups, but we've also done storytelling, content, consultings, as well as actual products, physical and digital, especially during a pandemic when cooking was very hard to do. Recently, we've deep dived into the sustainability aspect of food and really thought about what food and the whole production chain of it, what the effect is on our environment. And looking at it pretty quickly, it was very clear that the biggest impact or positive impact we can make on our environment is by the reduction of animal products or consumption of animal products. And this is not just meat and fish, but also dairy and eggs. So that's why 3 years ago now, we've actually tried out plant-based cooking, and we stuck with it then, because we also think normally, and I think in cooking as well as in art, the more you limit yourself, the more creative you become. And now if you think about vegan or plant-based cooking and the only thing you can think of is kind of a bland salad or a boring tofu, which is very often the only thing people can imagine, we'd like to show you what the future of food could look like. So these pictures were taken in May at the World Economic Forum in Davos. We've now cooked there for 6 years in a row, where we curate the pavilion of our high school and university. And I think you can see our style is very kind of elegant and simple and reduced, but we also like it to be innovative and kind of thought-provoking. In the first dish, maybe you saw the rhubarb. And actually below, as we also like to think about developing new products, and I see some people were here yesterday for a tasting, so we've developed a vegan foie gras based on nuts, which actually is underneath these pickled rhubarb sheets. Yeah, I think in the end, you could also see that we also like to accompany our food with very interesting beverages. They're always homemade. We also like to use waste products from the kitchen, which you very often have. For example, we do coffee ground kombucha or do cocktails made of preserving liquids or pickling liquids in the kitchen. So Remo will tell you about other aspects of our work.
Thank you, Sue. Hi, everybody. So as Sue mentioned, we are first and foremost, I would say, we are a catering company, but we also do a lot of content and storytelling that we like to serve alongside our food. So we also research a lot of sustainability data, a lot of science facts about how the food is produced, what impact it has in terms of CO2 emissions, but also water use and other aspects of sustainability. And we research that and we also present it to our guests, because food is always also story. It's always identity. It's always something that you experience that you take with you. And these experiences also shape how you perceive the flavor and the taste of the food and how you value the food. So we try to sort of entertain and educate and supplement those amazing dishes that Sue's usually cooking. She's our head chef, by the way. And in our service setting, we we serve these little gadgets, but also like decorations, also handouts, things to touch, things to play with, as an inspiration, as an educational tool. And I'm just gonna show you some of those. I find that one in the middle very funny, that you, Philip, used the same design for the sort of very overall picture, and we used the design for a very deep dive picture into like sustainability facts of a single product. For example, if you have an espresso, we sort of wanted to show, well, this person got a cappuccino, which messed up the whole picture, but if you had an espresso, how much of that espresso would actually be caused by like how much of the CO2 emissions of that espresso would be caused by the different stages of producing the coffee beans, of transporting and grinding it and heating the water, and then in the end, like serving and cleaning up the dishes. And then we also do, we sort of, this one is stolen from the well-known like energy label that you all know if you buy a new dishwasher or a new machine for your home, where we sort of graded different, here it's beverages, but also food products, in terms of how they compare, like how greenhouse gas efficient they are compared to each other. You see the espresso mentioned before is pretty well off, and the cappuccino, I should point to that side and not to the laptop. The cappuccino is a bit further at the bottom because you add a lot of cow milk, and as the remark says, this one would be better if you used oat milk instead. The champagne, very unfortunately, is still further at the bottom. So we try to sort of playfully sort of give those things to our guests as additional information, and also as some things to talk about. Some of you have been here yesterday and have seen this little menu card as well. On this chart you see the different CO2 emissions that food has, and we noticed that the plant-based things are all the things at the very bottom. So the bottommost 4 pieces are the plant-based foods, apart from chocolate, which for us was a good motivation to go plant-based and sort of stick to that niche. Alongside our storytelling work, we also do consulting work for other companies. We think about digitalization, we think about how food and art can interact and can also be an additional value for other players in the gastronomy field, mostly around Zurich, where we work and live. We think about future technologies illustrated here. We had a food printer, we had like precision laser cutters doing those little shapes at the bottom, or the nori algae for the sushi at the top. We also produced our own apps, which was great during the pandemic. I have a background in computer science. That's how I met Sue. I studied computer science and Sue studied physics. So we met at the university, and we also designed our own food apps that we use to communicate our knowledge, our recipes, but also like things that we just use for ourselves and are useful tools. So I don't want to keep you much longer, and I think, Nora, you're next up, is that right? Should we?
Wheel this.
Perfect, yes, please.
Thank you. Hi everyone, hola a todos. My name is Nora. I'm from right here, from Madrid. I'm going to talk about my collective, The Gramounds, which I... ¿Qué hago, Edu? ¿Quieren que hable en español? Vale, are you okay with me talking about this in Spanish? Okay. Lo que pasa es que no van a entender nada ellos.
We do have
Okay,
a
I'm going to do both. I'm going to do both. Let there be peace. Vale. No pasa nada, no pasa nada. Don't worry about it. I got it. So, I'm going to do both. Voy a hacer las dos, ¿vale? Simultáneamente. Como... ¿Sí? Vale. Ok, en español. Vale, mi nombre es Nora. Ya me he despistado. He venido a presentar mi colectivo de Gramounds. Es un colectivo que empecé con Finn Thompson, aquí en el medio, cuando estaba en Londres estudiando arte, y decidimos hacer proyectos para intentar sacar dinero para nuestro colectivo. Era otro colectivo por aquel entonces. Entonces empezamos a hacer cenas, porque también soy cocinera. Pero de lo que nos dimos cuenta muy rápido es que estas cenas tenían mucho potencial como proyecto, no solo como fundraiser, no solo como para sacar dinero para otras cosas. Entonces, lo que empezamos a hacer fue organizar exposiciones o proyectos artísticos en los que desarrollábamos una cena en los que cada uno de los platos hacía referencia a una de las obras que estaban expuestas. Y empezamos a hacer eso a una escala bastante pequeñita. Y entonces así empezó nuestro supper club. O sea, The Gramounds empezó como un supper club, que significa como un pop-up, ¿vale? Como unas cenas pop-up. Entonces hicimos esto durante algunos años. Lo que hacíamos era comisionar a artistas una expo con la idea en mente de que iba a ser una cena. Entonces se podían involucrar en la creación de las obras que se iban a mostrar, pero también, yo qué sé, en la mesa, en cómo querían que se comiera algo, en a lo mejor quiero que vean este vídeo mientras se comen este plato. Entonces, en lo que se convirtió este Supper Club era como en un formato distinto de mostrar arte y de comunicar información, o una manera distinta de acercar el arte contemporáneo a un público que a lo mejor no está tan familiarizado con el arte contemporáneo. Es decir, un vehículo. A way in. Os voy a enseñar algunas de las fotos de nuestros primeros supper clubs allí en Londres. También algunos artistas como que producían toda la vajilla para algunos platos, dependiendo del tema que querían tratar. Y bueno, The Gramounds empezó a crecer y después de que empezamos a hacer los supper clubs, también nos llamaron como de instituciones y de otros sitios para hacer colaboraciones con ellos. Entonces empezamos a trabajar no solo a partir de las exposiciones que comisionábamos nosotros, sino que empezamos a trabajar con otros sitios que ya tenían exposiciones o sitios que querían desarrollar ideas a través de la comida, entonces nos llamaban a nosotros. Entonces, por ejemplo, esta es una cena que hicimos con una institución allí que quería desarrollar una cena sobre la idea del futurismo italiano, bastante trillada. Bueno, para los que estén familiarizados con la historia del arte, el futurismo italiano fue como un movimiento muy performático de hace un poco más de 100 años, en el que los artistas empezaron a incluir la comida en las performances que hacían. Entonces hicimos como una versión de esto, que son las imágenes de esto, que incluyó performance, incluyó una serie de cosas. También por ejemplo, es una imagen de un proyecto que hicimos con una feria de arte contemporáneo allí, en la que desarrollamos una cena que era sobre el tema del capitalismo millennial. Entonces, por ejemplo, servimos este plato en un ordenador. Bueno, está el fondo de Windows y entonces era como emulando un ordenador. Y luego la tercera cosa que hacemos, bueno, perdón, a ver, Supper Clubs, Collaborations, Projects, no, sí, la tercera cosa que hacemos en The Grammars son proyectos. Entonces, en el apartado proyectos, en The Grammars funcionamos más a nivel artístico, es decir, nosotros elegimos el tema en el que estamos interesados y en el que queremos desarrollar a nivel artístico, y a través de proyectos de comida o situaciones comestibles o similar, hablamos de lo que nos interesa hablar. Entonces, por ejemplo, este es un proyecto que desarrollamos en Ciudad de México, en una residencia, en el que queríamos hablar del sistema capital, pero de una manera a través de la comida, obviamente, pero lo que queríamos hacer era que se viera cómo el sistema capital se come a sí mismo y se autoagota. Entonces, lo que hicimos fue construir una mesa para comer, que es esta que veis aquí, en la que parte de la mesa era una barbacoa que se alimentaba de la propia mesa. Es decir, que para comer tenías que quemar la plataforma donde comes. Entonces, a lo largo de la noche o a lo largo del evento la fuimos consumiendo. Y la comida que elegimos poner, elegimos como plantas autóctonas de México que tienen algún componente venenoso, es decir, que como que se han intentado resistir un poco al ser humano, pero el ser humano al final ha llegado a poder comérselo, pero las veíamos como las plantas rebeldes del mundo comestible. Y ahora os voy a enseñar lo que más hacemos ahora, que es, ¿is it this one? It's Google Chrome, right? Okay, wait. Yeah. Esta es nuestra preciosa web. Y os voy a hablar ahora, chicos, de lo que más hacemos, que son nuestros cursos online. Vale. También damos cursos online, entonces os voy a explicar muy brevemente cómo surgieron. Queríamos hacer una residencia de arte con participantes y tal, en el que tratáramos todos estos temas con la comida, pero de una manera bastante como física. Y hablamos con el Instituto de Estudios Postnaturales aquí en Madrid, que no sé si os suena alguno. Si no os suena, es tan genial, para que lo chequéis. Y estábamos a punto de lanzar la convocatoria y pasó el COVID. Entonces lo que decidimos fue convertirlo en un curso online. Y así surgió Food Cosmogonies, Cosmogonías de la Comida. A ver, sí. Vale, entonces este curso surgió como un curso de 2 meses en el que Inés y yo, que es la tercera componente, desarrollamos un temario en el que hablábamos de la comida, pero desde muchos ángulos. Es decir, en realidad lo que hacemos en Food Cosmogonies es hablar del mundo a través de la comida. Entonces, bueno, os voy a resumir un poco. Este año, por ejemplo, tenemos 2 cursos que ya han empezado. En el primero hablamos un poco es como nuestro curso base, y hablamos, por ejemplo, de la comida y la historia, de la comida y el imperio, de la comida y la colonización, de la comida y el género, de la comida y el arte, es decir, de absolutamente todo lo que nos interesa, pero a través de la comida, porque creemos que la comida es el mejor vehículo para transportar información, básicamente. Se hace más digerible. Y luego tenemos otro curso que se llama Expediciones, que está formado solamente por guest speakers, por invitados, porque queríamos como darle un poco más de diversidad al curso, porque no, o sea, que no estemos solo Inés y yo hablando sobre lo que creemos de la historia del imperio, sino que haya también diversidad de voces. Y entonces, bueno, por ejemplo, os voy a enseñar la gente que traemos, que no sé por qué salen las fotos en pequeñito. Gente que os pueda sonar, por ejemplo, Caroline Steele es una escritora que tiene varios libros súper interesantes, va a dar una clase con nosotros. Una artista que expone bastante aquí, por ejemplo, Asunción Molinos Gordo, que su trabajo toca bastante la comida. Por ejemplo, tenemos a Rowan White, que es una activista nativoamericana que es activista de semillas y de su uso. Tenemos a Douglas MacArthur, que tiene una escuela en Londres súper interesante de cocina, pero con zero waste, es decir, sin generar ningún tipo de residuos. Bueno, etcétera, etcétera. Si os interesa lo podéis echar un ojo. Y ya me callo, que me he embalado. Sorry guys, thank you so much. Sorry I did this in not your language. I hope that was okay.
I have my language in my ears.
Okay.
It's beautiful. Thank you, Nora. That was fascinating. And I guess as a sort of kicking off point, it's clear to me that cooking and food preparation is simultaneously chemistry, but also at the same time it's this cosmic process. And just the word cosmogonies, I can't but see this and immediately think about this interplay, these two layers, this kind of chemical physical layer and this cosmic ritual cultural layer. And this is something I'm very interested in. And so at the same time as we have representatives here from science and art, I suppose I want to know why that kind of chemical part, that science layer, seems to be rejected often, both, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong here, but both in the art world, but also in the kitchen. Do you guys ever feel, well, I'll start with Remo. Do you ever feel like stigmatized for your kind of, your presence as a scientist, like in the kitchen? Yeah, let's start there, and then maybe we can talk about art.
Yeah, thank you. I myself, gladly, I'm not very often in the kitchen. Sue kicks me out when I come in. But yeah, we are stigmatized a lot, and I think that's why what we did initially, our first pop-up restaurant that we did in Zurich was on the terrace of the ETH Zurich, the very well-known university, and it's a technical university, and I think those people know they struggle a lot, that their fields, their like expertise, their engineering and computer science and math disciplines are very strongly associated with like anti-romantic and anti-nice. So they enjoyed a lot that we would combine science facts with candlelight and good background data with good cocktails. And they would love us for that. And the feedback we had from the academics, from these technical disciplines mostly, was overwhelming because we were the first to do that. And I think that's a very strong reaction that you have with many people, that you have sort of, oh, science, that's not romantic, that's not cool, that's nothing I want at a nice dinner. That's something for the lab hats and the weird glasses and nerdy people, yeah, like us. Yeah, and also on the other side, our chefs are sometimes the same. But then when they work with us, because they have to, because we hired them, they discover that we have a lot to teach them, and also we discover that they have a lot to teach us. So the synthesis in our kitchen is very interesting, I think.
Just what do you mean by that in terms of the chefs? Because it seems to me that if you're working in a kitchen, protocol, regulations, timing, temperatures, units, conversions, this is the stuff that we would deal with in a laboratory, no? So, I mean, yeah, maybe you could just say how they kind of conceptualize themselves if they kind of don't see that as science.
Yeah, I think not all chefs are the same. The molecular cuisine, which was very strong here in Spain, I think they were the first like scientists in the kitchen, or maybe also chefs in the lab, and they saw this similarity between cooking and science, and between cooking and chemistry and cooking and biology. They saw that very strongly, but many chefs don't. And the traditional chef's education is that the art and craft of being a chef is exactly that, an art and a craft, which should not be sort of now overruled with new findings from laboratories. And whenever you find a new technique coming up, the molecular gastronomy was very strong in that. They would bring up first sous vide cooking, and then they would bring up like spherification and working with liquid gases and all those kinds of things. And each of those techniques would first experience a very strong resistance, and then when you demonstrate the usages and the advantages, like nowadays every every Michelin star restaurant does spheres and does sous vide cooking and does all those techniques that were first rejected by them. So I think it is something that goes towards a synthesis naturally, but doesn't come naturally to them at first.
I'm glad you brought up molecular gastronomy, because it really highlights the performative nature of the dining experience. You know, the way that we need to have some kind of frame of reference for the thing that we're eating, and suddenly when we don't, we kind of get a bit freaked out. Like, why am I seeing test tubes? Like, why am I seeing bubbles? Maybe this would be something I'd be more likely to see in an art gallery where we're kind of expecting some degree of performativity. Though I think like there are some very interesting artists at the moment working with senses beyond just the visual. You know, like smell is increasingly something that you might encounter in a kind of in an artistic context, but so is playing with the spatial audio, like with yeah, I don't know, but I mean, does this kind of make sense to you, Nora? I mean, is there a kind of pressure, do you think, on artists to present a kind of pigeonholed, generic presentation of like food politics and kind of the way that you address food? Are you also stigmatized if you kind of start freaking people out by playing with their meals too much?
Sorry, I said I think they'd like that. No, but I can think of a few. There's so much variety in the gallery and outside the gallery. But I can think of artists who work with food, who work with scientists or data. For example, I can think of cooking sections who were nominated for the Turner Prize. I would say their work is mainly aestheticizing data about food and making it arty, or making it into an installation that can appeal to a wider audience. But there's also artists that work with very visual statements. I mean, there's so much variety of everything. So I wouldn't say there's a stigma at all in the art world.
I'm quite interested in the disconnect that sort of emerges between like the way that food performances take place in the art world versus like the presentation of food in pop culture. Like, food in movies is something that we've kind of like looked at and thought about, and you have this, for example, I was thinking recently about food in science fiction, where like, it kind of came out of the space age when stuff actually did look like the molecular gastronomy. It was cubes and tubes and dehydrated matter and so on, to kind of, the present moment where it can kind of vary from sort of stuff that's meant to be freaky and disgusting, the stuff that's meant to kind of make you feel like more at home in a new kind of setting. I don't know. I'm kind of interested to know like whether we really think that the art, the presentation of food in art is kind of influencing chefs, or if it's like a purely one-way street of influence. What do you think?
No, I'd say it's mutual.
Yeah.
I'd say art, like I can think for example, of my partner Ines, my partner in the Grandmoms, she brings fermentation into the gallery in a very direct way, in a very literal way. What she does is she brings ferments and she shows them, not in such a, you know, like laborious aesthetic or anything. It's like, this is what it is, and it is art because of that sort of thing. But I do think that science fiction plays a really big role in introducing what we might consider normal in the future. And I think that's an important role that's very often overlooked. But you might know more about that, because I think you're writing about that, right? Oops.
I am, but I was just going to say that we had a really great talk during our workshop yesterday with Sean Raspert and Lucy Chinen from Non-Food. This is a company that makes an algae bar, and you know, we're kind of constantly told that algae is the food of the future just because it's so nutritious and yet easy to grow and can grow in, like, you know, with a very small land footprint and be and feed a lot of people. But, you know, first of all, they make the point that actually it's been part of many cuisines for, you know, since time immemorial. But also that you know, this kind of idea that it's like sci-fi food. I mean, it can also be played to your advantage. Like, it can be like a fun thing to work with. Andrea, were you going to ask a question?
No,
I think you're off.
No, I was just thinking that there is sci-fi and sci-fi, right? So if you read sci-fi, there's one thing. If you look at Hollywood sci-fi, then the depiction of food that they have sometimes is daunting. So there is, it's a very much a representation of how we are failing to even imagine in our fantasies like something new, right? So the Matrix brings, you know, the goo. And even Star Trek at some point brought, I think it was the first time that an Happy Meal was showed on television. It was on Star Trek. And so, like, you see how the reality constantly wants to limit the possibilities of novelty. And yeah, like yesterday with Sean and Lucy, the lecture that Philip just mentioned, they brought to us like this very interesting idea of the hedonic paradigm of flavor. So they were explaining that the human brain needs a certain amount of exposure. If I recall correctly, it's like 10 times a certain amount of exposure to novel foods, novel flavors, before we actually can make an informed decision about what we are eating. And historically, that was very easy because of scarcity. So because we were poor, we were actually, you know, forced to eat something over and over. And at some point, we learned to like it, or at least like we would overcome this neophobia, this fear of something new, and then just make an assessment based on the, you know, on the flavor of it. But somehow now that we have an abundance of food available to us, we can afford just to make a judgment right away. You know, we eat, either we like it or we don't like it. So there is this paradox where we have abundance on one side because of science, because of art, but then we limit our choice to only what is appealing at first instance. So I guess my question both to scientists and artists is like, is there a way to embrace novelty without being forced to embrace novelty, either by economical condition or pervasive advertisement? I guess the example we brought up yesterday was like Red Bull, new flavor. Some might argue that it's a very terrible flavor, but nevertheless, now people like it. It's a flavor of something. It's weird, exactly. It's really weird. It's weird that it's so famous and so pervasive to the point that like energy drink now try to simulate that flavor, because if you want to have something that is energetic, you expect that flavor, right? So do you need like a multi-billion-dollar advertising PR agency at your back in order to introduce new flavor? Or maybe artists can do it much cheaply?
Well, that reminds me of the story of the potato, because the good old story of the potato, because the potato, well, in Europe, was brought maybe 500 years ago or something like that, by the colonizers or the invaders. And at first, it was considered a tuber that would make you ill and that would give you a lot of gas. So it was famous for that at the beginning, so nobody would eat it at all. It was considered food for prisoners or for slaves or for, very, very low-class people. And it was like that for maybe like a good 100 years until this French chef was imprisoned by the Russians, and the Russians would feed him potatoes. And he actually realized, the potatoes aren't so bad. So then when he was released, I think he was hired by the monarchy in France to cook. I think his name is Savarin, but I might be making this up. You might have to Google it. I don't take responsibility, but what he did to make potatoes popular was he invented a million ways to cook them. He introduced them to the monarchy, and he made the monarchy publicize them. He even made the queen wear a dress with potato flowers in it to make it appealing. So my answer is unclear, but I guess there is a way to engineer acceptance of a food, and I guess you do need a bit of influence to do that. So today that might mean millions of dollars.
I just want to say that the potato story is, of course, mirrored again in the lobster story, because lobster was something that was only to be given to animals as feed, and even then farmers were quite reluctant to do it. There's this famous, I'm not quite sure if it's apocryphal, but there's this famous anecdote that in the US they legislated so that prisoners wouldn't be served lobster because it would just be too cruel even for those behind bars. Yeah, I think it was a number of times, like per month or whatever. Poor them. And this also, again, we can see with the advent of something like a single-cell protein. I grew up eating corn, which is this, brand of a fungus that is, very easy to kind of pre-produce, and one of the weird alchemical kind of tricks of the current food system that we have is the way that it can take a waste product, and high fructose corn syrup would be the key example in the US, and then translate it into a million different products. So on the one hand, this process is kind of devious, but on the other hand, it's also quite miraculous. And the question that we're always asking ourselves is, what if the input can be changed from corn, which is taking up is really only sort of in surplus because of government subsidies that were set up many decades ago for an entirely different purpose, is there kind of as a surplus. And so, the engineering question, I think that there is a route. It involves things like making the product available. It's about telling people, making it clear what one ought to do with it. It's about making it affordable. But crucially, again, it's about making it desirable. And it's about engineering that kind of mimetic spreading of kind of objects of desire throughout society. I'm not saying that any of these things are easy to achieve. I just think that there is a route. Anyway, Remo.
Yeah, and another analogy that came to my mind when you mentioned the potato is the soy. Soybean, I think it's originally from Asia. Do you hear me? Yeah. And they brought it to Western Europe in around 1900 and started like cultivating it. It's a bit difficult to cultivate, so that took some time. But people didn't really take this up, didn't really want to eat this. But nowadays, with more and more like fusion cuisine, you call it, like with the Asian influence, with tofu from a lot of mainland Asia, but also like edamame, which is a delicacy served for starters in Japan all the time. People start taking it up because it's cool. We have Japanese cuisine. It's a cool thing to do, and the soy for those Japanese starters comes usually from France and Germany. I don't know, in Spain probably from Spain, and still soy for many people has a bad image as a sort of animal feed and destroying the planet, because they burn down huge swaths of the rainforest in Brazil to feed all the beef livestock all over the world. But the soy that we eat in Europe is actually farmed in Europe and is by now a native plant in Europe as well.
Yeah, I think Philip hit a very key point, at least for us at the Almanac, which is desirability, taste. It must taste good. There's no other way around. And this is a nice transition maybe to our next session. The focus group that the participant of the workshop have participated to yesterday, and Remo and Sue helped us conducing, was based on an actual experiment research done in a university in Switzerland. And this research, basically, the goal was to serve chocolate with inside bugs, insects, to two different groups. One group would have been nudged and presented this item as eco-friendly, sustainable, while the other group would have just be presented this item as fashionable, tasty, super good. And they realized that people were more likely to eat that specific item, that specific chocolate with the insect, if it would be presented as sexy, as desirable. And I think the other group, and we had a first-hand experience yesterday with the focus group, the moment you present a food as sustainable, people get extremely defensive. There is a trigger of anxiety.
To the degree they don't want to eat, to the degree that the food doesn't get eaten because we're too busy arguing.
Yeah, your brain immediately gets engaged in everything except the expectation of flavor, the expectation of pleasure. And Nora has a very interesting artwork performance that she did in Arctic called The Reluctant Goodbye. And I think that was, it wasn't strictly connected to food, but it was the perfect visualization and representation of the sentiment that the participants of the workshop brought up when we asked them, what are your anxieties connected to food? And guilt, responsibility, helplessness were one of many other negative sentiments that were brought up. And so in that work you propose, I quote, a proactive grieving for the lost eyes. And so that reminds me that every decision connected to food especially, hides the idea that every individual action has to be the definitive solution, and this generates anxiety. It gives so much responsibility to the individual, to the point that we are unable to see alternatives, unable to see where the actual, effective, efficient levers are. And I think that this individualization of the responsibility of solving problems connected to climate change, of food production, has actually the opposite effect. It consolidates and actually intensify the concern that an individual has about his own or their own safety and the political powerlessness. So, can you maybe introduce the work, talk a little bit about it, and share if the artists maybe were responsible in creating this anxious environment around the topic of food, and maybe you have some way forward that doesn't involve, getting defensive.
Thank you. Sure. So this performance, I'm a performer. I'm an artist. Usually, before I do these kind of things, or as I do these kind of things. So I did this performance where I went to the Arctic, to an island called Svalbard, which is in the North Pole. And the idea was to get in this ship, in this velero sort of thing. And what I wanted to do was to make ice cubes and throw them back at the Arctic Sea. So I wanted to do this because thinking about climate change, what I felt was powerlessness, like we don't have any agency over it at all. And also what I was feeling is whatever we do, we are perpetuating it and contributing to it anyway. But we still want to do something about it. So it's this kind of desperate proactiveness drive within a situation where you can see no exit, but you still want to try something that you understand is ridiculous. And you understand by doing this, you might be even making it worse. But by doing it, I guess it's a selfish act of making you feel that you're doing something with the limited agency that you have as a citizen, but within the desperation. But it's a kind of soft desperation. It's a desperation where you can cohabit, like you can live in it. You can live in the struggle. You can cohabit the struggle, or inhabit the struggle. So, yeah, that was the idea. So I went up there and I made some ice cubes and I just
Can
throw
I
them.
add a meta narrative onto this?
Of
Because
course.
I love this piece, in partly because it sits nicely in tandem with Olafur Eliasson's transporting an iceberg from the Arctic, down to New York or down to London, and to sit and let it melt there. And this has been kind of totted up as one of the sort of most carbon-intensive artworks, in recent years. Icebergs are very heavy; it's very difficult to transport them. So I actually love the way that kind of in reversing that, you kind of show up this almost sort of benign helplessness or something like that. Like everything you're doing is going to have some energy cost. We're animals. We're organisms. We do have an energy cost, and I think it's very important with the art stuff to draw a distinction between what the artwork is and what it's about. It's not necessarily the case that because something is about climate change, it's doing anything to kind of solve climate change. And I loved that your artwork kind of seemed to acknowledge that, and it was very beautiful as a result. I wondered, this kind of anxiety is definitely something that you guys are going to face just because you're putting out there that we're very interested in the kind of environmental impact of food production and kind of what you do. And I remember yesterday Sue mentioning that it's just like this Ouroboros, you say, well, we've found this input that's like, way less carbon intensive. But what about the packaging? But what about the waste? But what about, everyone suddenly like becomes, the interrogator when it comes to this. And just quickly, I also wanted to say that I think that we still, despite our love of, mushrooms and fungi, there's like a what do they call the ecological turn in the humanities, but I think anthropocentrism is still our default position. And I think that much as people don't want to admit it, nature creates waste. Oxygen was once a waste product. Oxygen killed most of life on Earth at one point before, a kind of a way to use it was figured out. The nitrogen converting mycorrhizal fungi in the roots of plants, weren't always doing that process. This circularity does take time to kind of emerge. And so I just want to give a little sort of boost to Team Human to say that we do produce circularity over time. The question is whether we can do it quickly enough, whether we have the optimism that is going to make it possible, and also whether we're doing it in the right places. But let's go back. How do you kind of do you find this this kind of whataboutism is a big part of putting it out there, and how do you cope with it?
Thank you. put you on hold as well and say that I didn't know about this piece of art, but I find it very beautiful from this description and very sad and true at the same time. And I wonder, did the ice cubes melt or not?
Well,
Yes.
sorry. So I threw them back at sea.
Did they melt in the sea?
Well, I don't know. I couldn't track them, but I don't think so. I don't think so. But I'll tell you something. I was hoping to fill out my trays and leave them on the ship outside, on the outer deck, and I thought they would freeze, but it didn't. And I had to make my ice cubes in the ship's freezer. So, not looking good.
Yeah, not good. Okay.
They did
Yeah,
melt.
thank you. Cool. So coming back to your question, yes, we do of course see this whataboutism, this very multidimensionalism of sustainability. Whenever we say this food item has a better CO2 footprint than the other one, somebody comes up and says, well, but it has more packaging, and it traveled a longer way, and it generates more waste or whatever. There is no like perfect product, and nobody wants to eat just one perfect product. You need to have some variety, and you will always be guilty in a sense of something, because as you say, life and eating does generate waste and does need energy. What we try to do, we try to make ourselves actionable again by identifying what are the biggest chunks, what are the most important levers that you can have. And then showing how this can be fun and entertaining and very tasty, and how we can create new culture with products that haven't existed before, or with recipes that haven't existed before. We do take inspiration from like meat and dairy products and replace them with own-made, or also with like normal meat replacement things as well sometimes. But we also try to create like completely new things, just discover new plants and see if we can create a great food item with it without destroying the planet more than necessary.
And like, what role does data gathering play in this process? You know, how do you go about research, and is there any comparison with, you know, work that you've done in computer science, or maybe you know about Sue's physics? I can speak about that because Sue is an astrophysicist. I don't know if we mentioned this. Yeah, is there kind of any crossover? And also maybe you could tell us about your apps, because I'm very keen on them.
Cool. Yeah, there is of course a crossover whenever we try to sort of fix our like creative direction. We also research about the background data. We have one very famous study done by a British and a Swiss guy actually in 2018, comparing I think 40,000 different farms with our production processes for food items in a meta study. Of course, they didn't do that all themselves, and giving very good like global averages of CO2 emissions and water, and I think also like soil nitrification data and everything. And so we do have very, very good data what a global average might be for a beef fillet and for a tofu and for a piece of potato and whatever. But then of course this data is meaningless if you well, not meaningless, but only a sort of a basic indicator if you look at a very specific food item. So saying that a potato is more sustainable than a beefsteak doesn't mean that this potato is a very good potato in itself. It could be that somebody brought it from Chile and it's traveled such a long way that it doesn't make any sense to eat it here. So in that sense, we do also then take into account the experience of our chefs, working with local networks, working with other startups in our environment in Zurich that we know do work very like responsibly, and there's also this like chain of trust that we discussed, which is very important, that we don't know how to make a sustainable chocolate, but we do know the people who care about it and who do it, and they know their farmers, and they know that they work sustainably on their farms and so on. So by like then exploiting those local networks, we try to sort of optimize our products as far as we reasonably can, of course. And which is also a good thing as a gastronomer. You can then tell the story as well. For example, this chocolate, it's called La Flor. They travel to Colombia to source their own, like to identify their own coffee farms. they import the coffee by sailboat. So they put a lot of effort into bringing responsibly sourced coffee into Switzerland, and we trust them to do this. And, yeah. Where were we?
I have one more question for Remo as computer science, but also one for Nora as an artist. So I was, while I was researching your profile, where we were building this workshop, I come out to a quote where you define the dinner service as a protocol flow. So like,
Yes.
if a recipe
remember, yeah.
is like by nature procedural, I think that's not breaking news. I guess the question to you would be, where does novelty and randomness comes out in the kitchen, in cooking, in this protocol flow? And to Nora is the opposite. So if the computer scientist would describe the dinner service as protocol flow, how would an artist define a dinner service?
Just to heap back onto Nora's artwork, which we've really made the star of the show this evening. Of course, Svalbard is where the Global Seed Bank is, which is a database. It's a home for genetic resources stored in one of the most sort of, politically stable and geologically inert places. But crucially, there's also the entirety of GitHub stored on hard drives down there as well. So you have this kind of combination that I think is very key between, information that is, the planet, biological life, but then simultaneously the kind of means of understanding it or sorting it at the very least. Sorry, go for it.
Wow, that's great. If you studied theoretical computer science like I did, you see like those patterns everywhere, and sometimes you can't help it. Like you sort of need to nerd out about them, and I think that's what I did when I described the service flow as a sort of a computer flow chart. But of course, like those processes are, in organizing anything, you come towards like those procedural structures, those back and forth protocol things, and you, as a sort of a manager or as a sort of gastronomer, you like to eliminate this randomness because it sounds really bad. It sounds like shit will hit the fan if too much randomness comes in, and of course, a lot of like, if you have good people, enough of those good people at every stage, they try to eliminate randomness as well. Meaning, something happened because something randomly occurred in my blender. I don't know, randomly meaning I switched it on full and it splashed to the ceiling, and it's that, it's all the product is gone. So I need to sort of fix it and either produce more or improvise, produce something else, so that the next stage in this sort of protocol doesn't notice. So like every human element is also like an error correcting element in that flow. And you need, of course, to be creative. Like you need to reintroduce this randomness, or at least like novelty and innovation. And I don't know, we had different formats to create recipes in the kitchen. It's hard to sort of think of like one defining thing, but the most important one being people from different backgrounds. We have a lot of people who didn't study to be a chef. They actually, they were designers first and then became chefs afterwards. So they would have a lot of input from their former everyday life, and I would have a lot of feedback from the guests and a lot of ideas from my own like restaurant visits and everything, and I would feed those into the kitchen. So I think what the people bring into it is a lot of like input that's not randomness, but a lot of new things as well. So yeah. I don't know, maybe the artist has a better answer.
Okay, I'm conflicted because I think the kitchen is the perfect paradox where you have to be creative, and that for me must allow a space for randomness, but also in order to produce food for someone you do need a process. Like you need to know that water boils at 100 degrees maybe, or you know that this fry takes this amount of time to not burn. So I would call that a protocol. But I think health and safety, for example, is the enemy of creativity. So I'm conflicted here because I think you need both. You need to allow space for creativity, and that means erasing the protocol, but then when that is set or that is created, then you do need a protocol to produce it. So
in our kitchen, we often had that like time separated. So we had like those more leisurely, let's say, like usually more leisurely afternoon phases where we would prepare like huge bunches of one piece of food for the whole week, and then we would prepare like pre-prepare things that we would need later on, and we would sort of get ready for dinner service, but also have time for creativity. And somebody would come up to Sue and say, like, we have all those pickles. Can we deep fry them and see if they're tasty? And Sue was like, it sounds crazy, but let's try it. And after, I think a week after that, the deep fried pickles were fixed on our menu, and we couldn't take it off anymore because everybody loved them so much. So I think we do have, like, with those leisurely time slots, we have a lot of space for creativity. And then with the need for like disciplined production, we don't have that anymore. So we switch to a more like protocol thing where you have more orderly process.
exactly. Can I tell an anecdote related to this, which I think is related to this? So when I did my MA in my master's in London, I didn't feel like I had the right workshop. So because I needed a kitchen. Because I think cooking is also a thinking process, and well, back at the time, my thinking process was cooking, so I didn't have the right workshop to do my art masters. So I built a kitchen, but health and safety didn't let me use it. So that's why I was like, okay, I have the right workshop, I have the right space for it, but creativity is not allowed in because of health and safety. So that's why I'm like, I think maybe I'm the wrong person to ask, because I'm very emotional about health and safety. I'm very sensitive to that because of this that I just told you.
Regulations in general are like a very big, it's called governor in cybernetics, something that really closes down the passage of fuel and oxygen to things. Yeah. So anyone has questions?
We have one. Should we give the mic out so everyone can hear in translation and so on? Hi.
¿Hablo en español? Do I speak English? Well, I consider I am myself a food historian and food artist, having worked for more than 40 years all over the world on the subject, and I consider, I can't really believe that you don't consider food to be the element, the eloquence. I mean, you never speak with food, you don't know what can food say to you, what food ask you to do with him. Is not an interlocutor at all, food. Because food is not just an object. Food is the protagonist. It's like you, it's something alive. So you belong to food. Food is you and you are food. And food is to be offered to others, introduced to your body. So how can one consider food as if it would be something apart from everything and is charged with guiltiness that creativity is completely out of you can use creativity because it is forbidden or it is not allowed to be creative. It's completely impossible to think of food, cooking, art, science without considering the protagonism of food. Food is everything. Just is the only thing that exists is food. So you only have to ask food, to listen to food, understand food, see how people uses food, and the rest of the things are absolutely out of consideration. No rules, no symbol, nothing is out of food. In food is everything. It's the only thing that has survived. We have survived thanks to food. So food is wisdom. Everything is food in food. So start considering of food as just somebody who has lots of things to do about how can be it transformed into art without anybody understanding that you are entering food into rebellion, and so food is just something to be completely taken into account.
We totally agree. Like, I think the point, yeah, and the point of this whole panel was to find new languages with food. So there is the language of science, there is the language of art, and then there is the shared language in the kitchen. So all this language is mediated by information. And I think what we try to, present tonight was like all the possible translations that have to happen in order to understand the food and have this conversation that we need, because food, we totally agree that food is essential.
No, but food has been alienated. You are not considering
That's
food
good.
at all.
That's,
Good?
yeah.
Food, alienate food? No.
No, it's alienate the relationship that we have to food in order to fully embrace all the possibility of food.
No, food is survival. Food knows to perfection how will we survive to the guiltiness, to the fears of man when using it, to the acceptance of rules governing the way you are using food. It is impossible to feel guilty when you are cooking, offering food for other people. People know to perfection how to use food.
I mean, it's definitely possible to feel guilty when preparing food for other people in this contemporary situation when we feel a great deal of anxiety based on what we're being told. I'm not saying that it's the right response, but in an age where you worry about nutrition science, which seems to change every second day, you worry about, the climate impact of what you're doing, you worry about, whether you are providing food which is kind of deemed high quality enough for your family, for example. There's so much class and social pressure attached to the type of food you eat. And I mean, one of the things we've talked about this week is how, this myth that you, at any point in history, would prepare 3 home-cooked meals a day. Like, this is a fantasy and a kind of historical inaccuracy. People have been fed for all kinds of reasons throughout time. We talked about, what used to be a kind of institutional model of feeding where you were fed at school, or you were fed as part of the military, or you were fed as part of a religious order, or something like that, to the situation today where we have the restaurant model as the kind of dominant way that people are fed, even at home. So, this idea that you're given the menu, you have abundance, you have plenty, you have choice. This is a total anachronism. This was not the case for most people throughout most of history. In fact, for most people throughout most of history, your job was to produce food for someone else. It was to provide for the landlord, for the king, for those people who had wealth and money, which was always an elite minority. However, the point at which you entered this conversation by talking about the centrality of food, I certainly agree with you. And I think that the interesting point that Andrea made there about new languages for food is that actually you can make this point at a number of levels. The first time that, cells appeared in deep sea vents on Earth, the first thing they did was find energy. They wanted to eat, It's like reproduction and energy. Those are the two things that is fundamental and universal and part of all life. However, of course, as thinking apes, we also attach a symbolic layer to the thing that we're doing. So the anxiety, I think, comes in there. It's like, it's not really enough for us to just provide ourselves with even the nutrition and energy we need to live. We're kind of pressured, I would say, to also provide a spectacle, a performance, to demonstrate our status according to the places that we go to eat and all this stuff. And it's kind of maddening. And tomorrow is the final day of our 3 workshops here in Madrid. And what we're actually going to do tomorrow is think about, okay, we once had this institutional model where you kind of had to be there in order to be fed, because if you fell outside of an institution, there was a risk that you would starve. And of course, famine is still a very real possibility in parts of the world, but nowhere near on the scale that it was 100 years ago or 50 years ago even and before. But then we moved to this kind of, this model of you're the king, individualism, choice, all the rest of it. And then what might come after that? How do we combine the best of these different systems, the kind of the mission, the community level of the institutional side, but then also the choice, which we ultimately think is good and we think is actually probably constrained. you know, by the things that I mentioned in the first instance, by what gets farmed, what's available, the way that corporate marketing just keeps us kind of trapped eating the same foods and so on. So yeah, how do we expand food? How do we make it even more than what you're describing, which I completely agree. You know, it is a protagonist, but yeah, I don't know. I just did a very long agreement with what you said, basically. Does anyone else want to say something?
Yeah, I think what we see in the Nordic cuisine is a strong analogy to what you said as well, that people in the first time in history had a lot of different techniques, technologies to focus on the identity of a single food item, like a single kohlrabi or a single cabbage. And they would do this with such vigor, they would dominate the whole culinary world for years. So that's, I think, those chefs in this Nordic spirit, not only in the Nordic countries, but also in all over the world as imitators, they actually figured out that listening to the food and trying to discover the identity, like what can I do with this single item that grows in my neighbor's garden, actually gives them a lot of power and lets them discover a lot of new fragrances, a lot of new things to discover. Yeah, but I think that's just two sides of the same thing, right?
Maybe we should take the other question. Yeah, just for fairness. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. Maybe I can go to the next question. Enrique here. I kind of agree and disagree in a sense of, yes, food can be a very broad sense, right? So waste can be food, oxygen can be food, and this is what I want to introduce. Like, I actually think we are living in a post-survivalism mode. Like, we don't eat to survive anymore, right? So we eat a lot of times for pleasure, we eat a lot because we desire. Actually, we eat too much. And so that will be my, trigger question for you as a group. Like, so if we now don't eat mainly for survival, right? So if you are in this kind of post-survivalism society, and I'm not saying that there is no problems in society, which is, of course, not the condition of everyone, but let's assume that there is a general population which lives in a post, then what are we feeding? And my question is, are we feeding our minds then? And then if we are feeding our minds, are we feeding our memories? And then what is the role of this, in the future and in your work? And that will be my question. Thank you.
Cool. Feel inspired?
No, I would just add a thing that we're not only feeding our memories, it's also our memories that are feeding us. So like you cannot really separate that process. Every time you eat something, you create new memories, and the thing that you eat are affected by the memories that you have created before with other thing of food. So I think it's just what Philip was saying before, the paradox of abundance. We eat because we want to feel like kings right now, but somehow we feel anxious about it because...
Well, but there's also an evolutionary aspect to this that can't be sort of forgotten. We, for most of our career as a species, had to eat when we could, and we're constantly worried about not being able to get food. And I mean, we do, I think I really love your question, and I think like the eating with our minds and eating with our memories is absolutely there, but we're sort of also eating with the nervous system and the bodies that we've kind of been, that are us and the environment in which we exist. We and like if you go into a supermarket, I mean, they know this, right? Like the psychology of a supermarket is to overwhelm you with a display of abundance. And it has, of course, its own interesting history in the Cold War as a kind of, propaganda machine. I mean, that's kind of when it was developed. It was who has the best mass feeding system, the Soviets or the West. So no, I definitely think you're there. But I also think, again, there's not nearly enough self-forgiveness in this. It's very common on the one hand to say, we're gluttonous, we eat too much, obesity is kind of more of an issue than hunger. These are things that you often read about. But at the same time, we have, extreme, in the same way as we are just all prey to social media and the dopamine kind of cycles that emerge with these through the kind of attention economy algorithms. I mean, the same thing is going on with sugar. We have receptors for sugar in our guts that tell us, ooh, sugar's around. You better get some more. And I, for one, am definitely struggling with with this particular one. So yeah, you're onto something. But I just personally, I do think that a little self-forgiveness and self-awareness is definitely kind of missing from this. We're not. I don't think we're bad.
Just let me just add one little, a short thought about it, because I think you touch in what is the crucial point, which is a supermarket, right? So it's our survival, mechanism of hunting now. It's hunting in a supermarket, and I do feel like we live now in two extremes. Like, so we rather live on the extreme of nostalgia, right? And everything is like old. We found the old recipe, it's old. We go back to something that was forgotten, and then like we are back, or then we are eating the future, And that's why I think that the memory question, that it seems that there is nothing in the middle. And I think you said something, which is we eat with our biology, like, which could be our biological memory, right? But then we also eat with our eyes, with our past, with our nostalgia, but we also eat with somehow with the futures. And even if we imprint, like a new food within the market, it normally falls into these two categories, right? I mean, there is subcategories in each one of them, but it's very interesting that you bring the part of the biology side and the supermarket, because that's the arena where all of this enters. I feel it's more there than actually at home or within social media. It's the supermarket arena where we are actually fighting for the future of food, actually. So I'm just correlating with you, with another thing.
I wanted to mention, actually, in British supermarkets, they started including a bakery, just because the smell of freshly baked bread would make people buy more food, or would make people hungry, which makes you buy more food. And I wanted to comment on something you said, which is, are we feeding our memories? And that makes me wonder, what do we consider food as well? Which, like, it opens it up for me.
I think it's a great question.
Yours or mine?
Yours. I mean, it's like we are doing like an object exquise, right? So it's like
I think it's a nice, like,
Yeah.
I don't know. For me, you sort of did it like that. Like, it opened it up with that. Yeah.
I have another question here, maybe.
In Spanish, because I don't speak very well English. Me quedé pensando en toda la cuestión del deseo, y ahora esto que traes del aroma en el supermercado también como que entra ahí en los sentidos, y la comida como la experiencia completa, ¿no? Como el alimento como en energía, absorción de energía, y también el sabor y toda esa parte más hedonista y qué sé yo. Y hablando del deseo, pensaba en eso, como que es súper difícil competir en un supermercado con toda esa construcción del deseo, del consumo y de lo que hay que comprar, y la belleza y como lo estéril de lo superficial de eso. Y por ahí, en todo tu trabajo con la historia y con ese recorrido de, bueno, la historia de la papa, o la historia, no sé, hace poco me contaban la historia del tequila, de los pequeños productores, no sé, unas ganas de tomar tequilas terribles, y yo no tomo alcohol, que de repente hay una salida en eso, en general, en pensar la comida como una experiencia, y una experiencia así, pensándola o construyéndola desde el deseo y desde la historia, y el consumidor de eso también empieza a ser parte. No es solo como, bueno, qué mecanismos de producción responsables, sino consumir responsablemente eso. Me parece como hermoso todo y súper interesante pensar en la comida desde todos esos puntos de vista, porque al final es lo que todos los días estamos consumiendo, como nada, eso era una opinión.
Should I answer in Spanish? Okay. Sí, me encanta mirar la comida desde la construcción del deseo, como lo has llamado tú, y es algo que también desde la construcción del tiempo-espacio, porque o sea, cuando comemos se juntan muchas cosas, se junta la forma en que te han criado, las memorias que tienes, todo esto, que formaría parte del pasado, pero también tu expectativa de cómo vas a ver todo, y yo creo que ahí entra el deseo. Entonces, para mí, como toda esta ingeniería de comer es como el ejemplo perfecto de como de física cuántica, de dónde nos encontramos aquí y ahora, en este momento, ingiriendo algo en el que se juntan el pasado, el presente, el futuro, el pasado siendo toda la construcción que eres como persona, que construye lo que tú proyectas en lo que te vas a comer, el futuro siendo toda la expectativa que tú generas sobre lo que te quieres comer, y el presente siendo pues lo que te estás comiendo, ¿no? Es como que confluye todo es un universo para mí.
No, y que pensaba, bueno, soy de Argentina obviamente, pero pensaba en las comunidades y en los pueblos originarios, todos esos rituales que tienen alrededor de la comida y por ahí esas cenas también que hacían, como eso, generar el momento de comer como un momento importante, es un momento súper importante, en donde estamos metiéndonos cosas en el cuerpo, como además de que nos alimentamos de un montón de cosas, pero esto de comer frente a la pantalla, bueno, ¿no? Como, y que por ahí eso, en otras épocas u otras comunidades, el momento de la comida es un momento súper especial, como que creo que es lo que se está perdiendo, como que es, bueno, voy caminando y voy comiendo algo, y la información de las tarjetitas también es como tener como un segundo, parar y tener un poco más de conciencia a distintos niveles, y creo que eso puede alimentar todo ese deseo de empezar a cuidar sostenible, amorosamente, y bueno, eso.
I think Fond is putting a lot of effort in creating new rituals around food, because there are not only the original rituals, but there are also new rituals. And I think that this is what I love about the work that Nora is doing with the other girls at Fonda, is because the supper clubs are really showing you like the possibilities of ritual building around the idea of food and art. I mean, it's an art in itself.
Sorry guys, I don't think we told you about Fondo. Fondo is the supper club that we had, that I showed you before in London, but we brought it to Madrid because I moved back to Spain a few months ago, and we started doing it here. And it's called Fondo, so you're more than welcome to come to our dinners. And yeah, what we try to do is we try to ritualize food from many angles. Like each dinner is a whole new world, but yeah, it has a lot to do with ritual and importance. And when you were talking about it, it was making me think that eating is actually this almost science fiction moment when matter transforms in your body into energy. If you think about it, it's completely absurd. Like, it should be treated like we treat funerals, which is the moment when we are transformed into a different matter, because it's the same thing. We have matter that is being transformed into something else. It's ridiculous. So yeah, we should treat it like almost like a funeral in the sense of the ritual, of the importance of the ritual.
And at the same time, those moments when something dies in a sense and becomes a part of you, it can not only become a part of you as energy, it can also become a part of you, as you said in the back there, as your memories and also as your social status or other dimensions, social interactions that you combine with it very strongly, like memories that you sort of rediscover from things that you ate in your childhood maybe. So it doesn't only become a thing in terms of energy, but also in many other dimensions, which I find very beautiful.
Hello. Hey guys. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge today. It's been super interesting. Because we're talking so much about the future and what could be, I don't want to put a pessimistic spin on it, but I think it's important to sort of know your enemies in a sense. And I'm curious what each of you thinks is sort of the biggest barrier to progressing and evolving to what you think the future could or should look like.
I'll start so I can pick which one. I think, as I mentioned before, neophobia is a really big barrier. That we are evolutionary wired towards skepticism, toward novelty. And that can be a problem, especially when you have to make decisions about new stuff at a pace that has never been seen before. We cannot just wait our biological brain to adapt to the pace of the current times. So I think we just need to accept that sometimes we just need to, jump and see what's on the other side. So I would take that one. I mean, to fix this one is not just as easy as to jump. There is all structure, culture that needs to change in order for this to happen, and that's extremely hard and difficult. But yeah, this is the direction that I would pick.
I'm gonna say policy making is the biggest barrier for me, because there's lobbies, you know how it works, and that's gonna play a crucial role in the future if we are to eat. So I will pick that one. Good old politics.
I'm a personal fan of the neophobia answer as well, but as you said that, I'll go for the comparable slowness of culture, which is, I think somebody yesterday said it takes like 3 generations until new food and new habits get installed, and we just have a faster problem at the moment than we can afford.
There are all these, very clear and real forces that you can point to. We talked about supermarkets. We didn't go so deeply into sort of farm policy, but it just is enormous, but it's so boring that no one ever wants to talk about it, except me. The common agricultural policy here in the EU, you pay farmers to keep the land in pretty much the worst condition that it could be. And this is extremely widespread, and farmers who try to get around it are punished for it economically, and everybody has to live. But I kind of agree with Remo. I mean, beyond these kind of material forces that we can see, I think we spend a lot of time pointing, over there, and are kind of unwilling to accept that even the most progressive among us are usually pretty conservative when it comes to food. I think that desire for experimentation and new flavors and new colors and new experiences that was sort of was commonplace in the 60s, when there was a much more kind of lust for innovation and so on. This has kind of fallen by the wayside now, and I think, recognizing the kind of cultural baggage that's attached to food would be kind of, or looking inwards, let's say, would be a really important step. I really loved Nora's comparison of food, assuming I got the translation right, I'm sure I did, guys, of food to quantum physics, because it's inherently weird and unstable and complex, and we definitely haven't figured it out yet. And I think that, the only way we're going to kind of progress food is to, is to bring back the laboratory spirit, is to bring back experimentation and invention. And we have to think seriously about it. We have to think about where it happens and why it happens and who's able to do it, but also boring questions about, like, if there's a great, novel food, what's the process that takes it from here to there and scales it and makes it accessible and affordable and all the rest of it. But yeah, I think the barriers are kind of everywhere, but I have nothing but confidence in the capacity of humans to cook. This has kind of been the thread throughout. And I think that, I also think that the human desire for for pleasure and sustenance, whether that be intellectual or material, is always going to be there. So I don't know, a little domino push can start an avalanche. Do we have another question?
Hi.
You have a mic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi again from the week, and thank you, Nora, for your presentation again, and Este. I'm just going to give a bit of context to my question, because basically I'm someone that kind of grew up with just liking all food, and I didn't dislike anything, and I was obsessed with food, and I see food now as kind of like an art material. I'm studying cooking, but have a background in art, and but also my relationship with food has changed due to being aware of people in my family with eating disorders. I'm sorry if this is a trigger for anyone, but I also had this kind of attitude of like, okay, well, I'm not going to control any of my the kind of food I want to eat. I'm going to explore experimentation and try to create this joy like around food, and to create a healthy relationship, because like I think it's very important. It's something that is quite loaded, and it's quite a difficult thing to talk about. But I think with younger generations, there is more and more of a pressure for like what we consume, and like how it kind of can be also, because food is like a reflection of society, and it's a part of us, that like the more sort of like problems there are in society, I think that there's sort of like a large amount of like people that have maybe like a bit of a challenging relationship with food and have shame attached to that. And actually, I think because it is such a big part of us, I've also seen, like through working with children with disabilities and in cooking classes, how it can help trauma and how it can help people reach a place of calm and tranquility. And cooking for people who have like an eating disorder, actually, if they have food prepared and the control is taken out of their hands, it's almost like it can create a relationship, like a new relationship with food is always possible. But I was just wondering if anyone had wanted to open up conversation about how food can be, on one hand, like a tool for like healing and kind of peace and creation, but also because it's a material object, it can also be something that is like a trigger for like destruction and control and fear, and something that can, like we have been talking about this week in the workshops, but can kind of create quite an emotional, as we've seen today, like an emotional response. Yeah, that's that.
Yeah, that capacity to both create and relieve trauma is like, it seems to be inherently part of what we're talking about. I don't know anyone who doesn't have in some way a kind of ecstatic yet complex relationship to food, and it can get really extreme, I know that. Does anyone else want to jump in here?
I think for me the key word is control, because food is something you control, because it's what you choose. Well, I mean, okay, I'm thinking out loud here. So I guess you can have fear of food when it's scarce, or when it's too much, so you don't want to eat it because, you know, you want to be in control of it, because therefore I mean, trauma from food can come from many different places. Like, you might want to consider food as the only thing you can control, and therefore you refuse to eat it, or it can be a protest thing, or it can come from so many places, but I think the key word is control. And I think that applies also when it's scarce. And that anxiety of control of food, I think, is what first led us to be agricultores. So I think it's incredibly ingrained in history, the fear and the control anxiety, because otherwise we would still be nomads and like gathering fruits from trees, but we gave food anxiety a priority in our priorities, and we became farmers because of that. Even if farming meant having a much less nutritious diet, because that's what happened when we started farming, the nutritious level of what we were eating like really decreased, and so even at that expense we chose control. So it's a big thing, I would say.
Thank you. And that's funny, because we were doing that pretend therapy sort of, let's choose a word, and that was my word, was control.
Yeah.
Because it's like the choice or sometimes for me it was like the choice to try to create like a creative space to experiment and have
improvisation, to use a set of skills to improvise in the kitchen, but also that for some people it's the complete opposite. It's like I have a friend that would have to look at the packet and would anxiously ask me and my housemates in London, like, this is past 1 hour past the sell-by date, can I eat it? And I would weigh her food. And I understood her relationship with food was the complete opposite, but she enjoyed the plate, you know? It was just the process was complete, and she was an artist as well at the time. So it was like even someone creative could not have that relationship with food because she was conditioned in a different sense, or her relationship was just different.
Yeah, I mean, this control is like very relevant to the previous question as well, because I think that our vision of what farming looks like needs to be loosened, but part of the reason that we can't do that is because of the kinds of fear that you're mentioning here. Like, if we see a picture of like, there's like, in the UK there's like documentaries constantly about shearing sheep, taking the wool off sheep. This is the thing that's just like always on the TV, but it's because when people see that, it's calming. You think the system is functioning, and I mean, food is a detection mechanism, right? Like, we're really sort of programmed to be looking out for issues with the food supply. That's why those news stories always rise to the top about it, whether it be inflation or logistical supply chains, and many of the most memorable stories of 2020 were related to food. They were milk being poured down drains, and animals being slaughtered, and workers being trapped, without access to healthcare and so on. And this is because we have this kind of deep anxiety. But I would say that the kind of counterpart to that is that we're not allowing, fermentation, algaculture, hydroponics, all these like interesting new ideas that are kind of in the ether or being, tested right now. They're kind of rejected by large parts of society because of that fear, and that this is not what farming's supposed to look like, which might be a nice point at which to come to a conclusion, because this evening we have more questions? Okay, sorry.
Can I just add one more thing to that? It's going to be very short. I think also the question is who holds the control, because, for example, when you were mentioning like the expiry dates, that's not in your control, and you're releasing control to someone else. So that's also like important in this picture, I think.
Yeah.
Sí. Hola, buenas tardes. Bueno, yo no sé si me repito o no, porque hablar de la comida es hablar en un poliedro de muchísimas caras, de infinitas, pero creo que queda un detalle importante. El proceso de la cocina, de comer, es un proceso comunitario. Es un proceso que empieza, como decía el compañero, la caza en el supermercado. Hay que elegir qué supermercado, qué red local, qué mercado de barrio, en dónde cazamos. Luego el cocinar, cocinas para alguien, para compartir la comida. No, la comida, aunque es un placer individual, con unos recuerdos propios, también es un acto social. En las casas es el mejor momento del día, si puede ser. Y bueno, pues esa relevancia comunitaria creo que es lo que hay que mantener para el futuro, porque no es individualismo. Por ejemplo, en el supermercado hablábamos, se nos da la paradoja de que es más barato 1 litro de zumo de naranja que 1 kilo de naranjas, algo que es bastante ilógico, pero ocurre. Y entonces creo que precisamente cuando la familia, cuando el individuo es invadido por el consumo, pues se pierde el gusto de comer, el gusto de cocinar, el gusto de compartir. Creo que esa parte comunitaria es importante incluso para encontrar nuevas experiencias, nuevas formas y que en el futuro pueda comer mucha más gente.
I guess until we can actually, choose the people we are including in our community, I think that's good. That has not been the case for most of the history. So I think community is important as long as we can decide and pick. And so the rituals again, and the people with whom you are having this ritual, it's very important. So it's just not community. Because, for example, you mentioned the family dinner might be not a pleasant memory for many people. Not because it's community and family that it means that it's good. For some people, family dinner, it's a constriction. You see in television, in movies, parents telling you are not allowed to leave the table. that's a very strong imposement, and that creates a micro trauma to you, right? Or to the people that are experiencing it. So community, yeah, it's good if you have control on it, right? So I think that
it's another one of these paradoxes.
Control is the key.
Yeah.
I was just going to add to that. Actually, Kant, the philosopher, el filósofo, I'll say in Spanish, if that's all right. El filósofo Kant tiene como publicadas una serie de reglas sobre cómo comer, ¿vale? Para que la comida no te contamine el cuerpo. Y la mayor parte de estas reglas se refieren a la elección de tus comensales. Porque para Kant, si tú comes con alguien que no te aporta buena conversación, es una parte crucial de la nutrición de la cena. Entonces puede hacer que tu cena sea horriblemente dañina o que sea increíblemente nutritiva. Me ha recordado lo que ha dicho Andrea. But I also think
bueno, estoy de acuerdo. Quizás cuando he hablado de familia hay que tener en cuenta cosas. Pero yo tengo la suerte de que normalmente he elegido comensales y ha sido placentero la elección. Claro. Entonces, estoy de acuerdo con vosotros y quizás el término familia hay que entenderlo en el siglo XXI, no como algo muy cerrado, como se entendía hace 100 años, sino incluso pudiendo elegir la gente que te rodea, no solo la que se te impone.
I also this question could lead back to a planetary cuisine concept. We could talk about the planetary cuisine as a community sort of, no? Okay, sorry, I'm looking for approval. Es que les estaba comentando que hay un concepto que ellos trabajan en su investigación, que es el concepto de cocina planetaria, en el que, si lo he entendido bien, se describe la cocina del futuro, la cocina que vamos a necesitar, como una infraestructura que tiene que pasar a nivel planetario si vamos a sobrevivir. Entonces, entiendo eso como una comunidad gigante que tiene que funcionar como un engranaje en el que la cocina no es a nivel familiar o individual, sino que es a nivel planetario, global. Entonces, yo creo que, respondiendo a tu pregunta inicial, la comunidad va a ser crucial en el futuro, pero yo creo que va a ser a escala global.
Bueno, tenemos tiempo para una última pregunta, ¿vale? Porque ya es la hora, así que vamos muy rápido y cerramos.
It's not a question, hi. It's just a short thought about the subject we were talking before, about how can we get the adoption of a new trend, or how can we make people who don't want to jump, you know, to maybe a vegetarian nutritional food, and how do we fight against these colorful labels and the sugar cycle that is so handy in the supermarket. And with the story of the bakery in the supermarket and the work of Taste Lab and what we experienced ourselves in the workshop these previous days, and what we also hear from experts is that what I thought is that the best marketing for food comes from senses, because when people like what they eat, they just adopt it, or at least it's easier.
I mean, the task is extremely difficult and requires taking into account a lot of the things that we've discussed today, and it's not just enough to think about what you're... This is why we talk about applying cooking into various different arenas, into governance, into economics, into you know, philosophical concepts even, into everything. But this is precisely the mission. You don't get there by chastising people, by telling them to eat less, to reduce themselves to some kind of aesthetic kind of like holiness, because to me this is not natural and we are part of nature. You have to create the most delicious and attractive food you can and work really, really hard to get it under people's noses. And like, maybe that's not what people want to hear. They want it to be a like kind of simple fix. But for me, desire is key, and desire is the thing that unfortunately a lot of green politics is really missing. You know, it's about telling each other off, telling each other you need to be punished. I don't think that's going to work. I think that if you look at the adoption of the kind of successful measures that kind of have come in through kind of, in response to climate change, and how does it happen? It happens because there's something that people desire and it spreads through the network. And we have amazing tools at our fingertips now. If we just see them as tools rather than kind of instruments of repression, you know, we might be able to use them to our advantage.
Sí, un segundo, creo que una palabra o unos términos clave son: el tiempo no existe, la memoria soy yo en este instante. Tengo 79 años, sé perfectamente a través de toda la vida que estoy escribiendo un tratado, una cronología de mi relación con la comida y la cocina a lo largo de mi vida. El tiempo no existe, la memoria es mi momento en este momento. Y además, el sistema no debe de ninguna manera anular mi capacidad de adaptación al entorno, porque caer presa de los miedos inducidos por el sistema que quiere que nosotros dependamos de él es lo que anula totalmente incluso el potencial creativo de pensar que se puede innovar. Y por otro lado, el yo no existe. O sea, ¿cómo voy a negar yo a alguien la posibilidad de compartir conmigo una comida? Tendré que relativizar mi yo para interesarme cómo es la existencia de esa persona, por qué para otros resulta insoportable, y adaptarme a una circunstancia poniendo mi yo absolutamente anulado. O sea, no debo de ninguna manera protagonizar la existencia, pensar que existe un pasado, un presente y un futuro al que me debo de dirigir. Esas son unas categorías que es que nunca jamás las ha tenido en cuenta ningún filósofo ni ningún cocinero, ni tienen ninguna validez, no nos van a llevar a ningún sitio.
Bueno, yo creo que hay muchas avenidas para llegar a muchos sitios y no creo que haya un solo camino dogmático que seguir, y creo que la validez se va decidiendo y se va negociando.
Bueno, yo creo que este es un buen momento para cerrar aquí, ¿no? Y a lo mejor con un poco de suerte, mientras cerramos, ahora abordarnos unos a otros, ¿no?, para continuar la conversación. Quería daros las gracias a todos. Bueno, thank you so much to Andrea, Nora, Philip, Remo and Sue, que sé que está por ahí, por esta jornada y por abrir todos estos temas tan interesantes, y al público por asistir, también por participar del debate y de la conversación que... Habéis llegado 5 segundos antes porque ese era el cierre. Así que muchas gracias y nos vemos en la próxima ocasión. Gracias.